In April 1995, Thomas Edward Benning, an experienced caver, ventured into a cave he knew well, confident in his ability to navigate its winding passages. But this time, he strayed from the familiar path, drawn to an obscure side tunnel that seemed to beckon him. Alone, with only a flickering miner's lamp, Thomas soon found himself hopelessly lost in the pitch-black depths. As his light faded and his hope dwindled, he was left with no choice but to rely on matches to guide him, each one a fleeting chance at survival. What began as a routine exploration quickly turned into a desperate fight for life. Before we dive into video, please subscribe our channel. As always, viewer discretion is advised. As Thomas continued deeper into the cave, everything seemed familiar at first. The walls of the cave, the winding tunnels, and the damp air made him feel at ease, as if he was in control. However, as he ventured further, he took a side passage that wasn't part of the usual route. This was an obscure tunnel, one that he had never explored before. It was darker and narrower than the main path, but he felt a strange pull, as though the cave was calling to him. For a while, everything seemed fine. But after about an hour of crawling and climbing, Thomas began to realize something was wrong. The familiar paths were no longer visible, and the twists and turns of the cave had started to confuse him. He had lost his way. At first, Thomas tried to retrace his steps, but everything looked the same, an endless maze of tunnels that seemed to stretch on forever. The feeling of comfort he had at the beginning of his journey was now replaced with growing anxiety. His sense of direction, which had always guided him in the past, failed him. The cave that once felt like a second home now seemed like a vast, terrifying labyrinth. To make matters worse, the small electric miner's lamp he had brought with him began to flicker. The dimming light added to his panic. The cave, which had seemed so familiar, now felt completely foreign and hostile. Soon, Thomas realized that he was lost. His heart started racing, and a cold sweat covered his body. He was deep underground, alone, and the light was fading fast. The adventure that had started with so much confidence now seemed like a deadly mistake. As the minutes turned into hours, Thomas's situation grew more dire. The flickering light from his miner's lamp had long since dimmed, leaving him in total darkness. Alone in the cave, with no way to see, he could feel panic creeping in. His heart raced, and his breath became shallow as he realized the gravity of his situation. Struggling to find his bearings, Thomas came up with a desperate idea. He remembered the matches he had in his pocket. Maybe the tiny flame could give him a brief moment of clarity, a way to find his way out of the darkness. With shaking hands, he struck the first match, its tiny flame barely enough to light up the rock walls around him. For a moment, it was a spark of hope, but as quickly as the light appeared, it flickered out. Undeterred, Thomas struck another match, then another, each one offering only a few seconds of light before fading into the thick blackness of the cave. The brief glimmers of light showed him nothing but cold, damp stone. His surroundings felt endless and suffocating. Despite the growing sense of hopelessness, he kept striking match after match, using the tiny flashes of light to navigate his way through the pitch-black maze. But the matches didn't last long. One by one, they burned out, leaving him in complete darkness once again. The flickers of hope were now gone, and Thomas was back to square one. The cold, silent cave seemed to mock him as he continued to crawl in the dark, his mind clouded by exhaustion and fear. He could barely see anything, and the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. It was as if the cave itself was taking him deeper, trapping him in its unrelenting grip. With no light and no way to guide himself, Thomas had no choice but to keep moving forward, relying on his sense of touch rather than sight. Crawling through the narrow, dark passages, he felt the cold, rough stone scraping against his skin. His body was exhausted, his limbs weak from hours of crawling and climbing. His stomach growled with hunger, and his throat was dry from dehydration. But despite his physical state, he couldn't stop. He had to keep going, searching for any way out of the darkness. To help him find his way back, Thomas began leaving markers along the way. He took off his shoes and left them behind, then a torn trash bag, and even pieces of his clothing. He hoped these small items would help him retrace his steps once he found a way out. Each item was a sign, a small piece of hope in the vast, unending cave. These markers were the only proof that he was still trying to escape. The cave was vast and labyrinthine, and he had no way of knowing if he was even moving in the right direction. But by leaving the markers behind, he was creating a trail, a faint thread of possibility that could lead him back to safety. As the hours passed, Thomas's body grew weaker, his movements slower. His hands were scraped and bleeding from the rough rock, and his legs burned with fatigue. But he kept crawling, driven by the thought that somewhere in this maze, there had to be an exit. Maybe just around the next corner, he thought. He couldn't give up. The markers he left behind were his only way of keeping track of his journey, a silent hope that somewhere, someone would find them and know where he had been. After what felt like an eternity of crawling through the oppressive darkness, Thomas finally stumbled upon something that gave him a brief flicker of hope, a narrow crack in the rock. The fissure, as it appeared, was barely 4 feet deep, but just wide enough to seem like a possible escape route. It looked like it could lead him to an open space, maybe even toward the entrance of the cave, where daylight and safety waited. His heart raced with anticipation, the possibility of freedom lighting a spark in his weary mind. With newfound determination, Thomas lowered himself into the crack. The walls were rough and jagged, making it difficult to maneuver, but he was desperate to escape. As he slipped into the fissure, he carefully tried to wedge his foot onto a small ledge to help support his weight. It seemed like his only chance, and he had to take it. But the moment his hips dropped past the narrowest point of the crevice, he realized the mistake he had made. The gap, which had seemed like a potential way out, was too tight. Before he could react, Thomas's body became wedged between the sharp rock walls. He tried shifting his weight to pull himself back out, but the rough stone pressed into his sides, holding him in place. The harder he pushed against the walls, the more his body was trapped. The fissure, which had promised an escape, had become his prison. His legs and arms were immobilized, and despite his frantic attempts to free himself, he couldn't move. The more he struggled, the tighter the grip of the cave became. It was as if the very earth had claimed him, and now there was no way out. As Thomas's body was firmly wedged in the narrow crevice, panic began to set in. His arms, weak from hours of crawling and searching for an escape, no longer had the strength to push himself free. The rock walls, rough and unforgiving, dug into his flesh, adding to the intense physical pain. He tried to twist and turn, pushing with all his remaining strength, but each movement only seemed to drive him deeper into the tight space. His legs were pinned, and the weight of his body was trapped by the rocks that had once seemed so familiar to him. In his desperation, Thomas clawed at the stone with his hands, his nails scraping uselessly against the cold, unyielding surface. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally. His body was telling him to stop, to give up. But his mind refused to accept the reality. He kept trying, thrashing and kicking with what little energy he had left. But the fissure was too narrow, and the stone walls were too sharp. Every attempt to free himself only made him feel more hopeless and trapped. His breathing grew shallow and uneven, the air feeling thick and suffocating as he realized the full extent of his situation. There was no way out. Even if he called for help, his voice barely carried in the dense silence of the cave. He was completely alone, and his chances of survival were growing slimmer with each passing moment. The harsh reality began to settle in. He was stuck, and there was nothing he could do. His body, once so strong and capable, had betrayed him, and now, in the darkness, he was helpless. The cave, which he had once explored with confidence, had now become his prison. As the days passed and Thomas failed to return home, his wife grew increasingly worried. She knew something was terribly wrong, especially since he had ventured into a cave he had explored many times before. Her concern quickly turned to fear, and she called the police. A search operation was launched, but the authorities had little idea of where exactly Thomas had gone. He hadn't told anyone which cave he was planning to explore, so the search was scattered and unfocused. The police began their search by combing through all the caves Thomas had previously visited, but there was no sign of him. The rescue team searched the more familiar areas of the cave system and found a few of Thomas's personal items, his shirt and sunglasses, but they missed the side passage he had taken. They stuck to the mapped paths, convinced that he must be somewhere along the main routes. But they didn't realize the critical mistake, the obscure path Thomas had chosen. The entrance to the hidden passage was barely noticeable, and the rescue team's lack of knowledge about the cave's hidden routes meant they couldn't even begin to search in the right direction. The search continued, but after several days, the chances of finding him seemed to grow slimmer. Thomas's wife, devastated, continued to call for help and posted flyers, but despite her efforts, the search operation was eventually called off. The authorities couldn't keep searching forever, and without more clues, they were forced to declare Thomas as missing. The once hopeful search now turned into a painful waiting game. His wife was left with only memories, wondering if she would ever know the truth about what had really happened to him in the deep, dark cave. As weeks turned into months, the search for Thomas came to an agonizing halt. His wife, desperate for answers, continued her efforts. She posted flyers, contacted local authorities, and reached out to anyone who might have seen or heard something. Yet, despite all her pleas, the case remained unsolved. The search was officially called off, and the authorities moved on to other cases. Thomas's wife was left with nothing but uncertainty and heartbreak. She had no way of knowing whether he was still alive, or if he had simply vanished into the cave's vast, unforgiving darkness. Days turned into weeks, then months, and as time passed, the hope of finding Thomas slowly faded. The public's interest dwindled, and the investigation lost momentum. His wife still held on to a small, fragile thread of hope that one day someone might find him, but she also began to fear that she would never know what had happened to her husband. She couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened in those final moments. Had he fought to survive? Had he given up? The cave, which once seemed like an adventurous place, now represented an endless abyss where time had no meaning. As the calendar pages turned, the memory of Thomas began to fade from public view. The story became one of many cold cases, buried under layers of time and indifference. But for his wife, the pain was still fresh, the questions unanswered. She couldn't stop wondering if the cave had swallowed him forever, or if the search had just failed to reach him in time. It wasn't until December 1996, more than a year and a half after Thomas had gone missing, that any new developments surfaced. A group of cavers, Bill Graff, Elizabeth Robb, and Dale Green, were exploring Black Cave as part of their own mapping project. They weren't searching for Thomas, but as they made their way deeper into the cave, they unknowingly retraced the same path Thomas had taken over a year earlier. Their exploration led them down a side passage that was unfamiliar to them, just as it had been to Thomas. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon something strange in the dirt, a burned matchbook. At first, they didn't think much of it, assuming it was just part of the cave's natural debris. But as they continued through the passage, they found more clues. A broken miner's lamp, matchsticks, and torn clothing, all scattered along the same path. The clues seemed to be retracing the steps of someone who had been lost in the cave. The cavers realized they were finding items that matched the description of what Thomas had carried with him during his exploration. Curiosity piqued, they decided to continue following the trail of markers. Hours later, when they retraced their steps and returned through the same narrow passage, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They ventured back into the passage and began to search more closely. As they crawled deeper, they discovered a shoe, and a little farther along, a sock. Eventually, they saw what appeared to be a bundle of fur on the cave floor. But when Rob got closer, she realized it wasn't fur at all. It was a body. The cavers froze in disbelief. They had found Thomas Edward Benning. His body had been in the cave for so long that they could hardly believe their eyes. What they had heard about months ago, the disappearance of a caver in Black Cave, had now become a haunting reality. The discovery of Thomas's body was both a shocking and tragic moment for the group of cavers. They had heard of his disappearance long ago, but seeing the evidence firsthand was something they could hardly process. They carefully photographed the scene and collected the items they had found for identification purposes. Upon closer inspection, they noticed the deep scratches in the rock around Thomas's body, clear signs of his desperate struggle against the unyielding walls of the cave. It was a haunting reminder of the pain and effort he had endured in his final moments. After marking the location with reflective markers to guide future visitors to the scene, the cavers immediately reported the discovery to the sheriff. The recovery operation began shortly after, but due to the tight spaces in the cave, it was a difficult and lengthy process. The cavers who had made the discovery helped with the recovery, making multiple trips into the cave to retrieve Thomas's body. When his wallet was found on him, it confirmed his identity. The heartbreaking truth was now clear. Thomas had been trapped in the cave for nearly 20 months, hidden deep underground, and the rescue operation that had been called off months ago could not reach him in time. If only the authorities had known about the hidden, obscure passage that Thomas had taken, maybe he could have been saved. Thomas's story serves as a tragic reflection of the unpredictability of nature and the limitations of human systems. Despite the efforts of the search teams and his wife's relentless pursuit of answers, Thomas's fate was sealed in the darkness of Black Cave. The cave had kept him hidden for so long, and only after more than a year and a half was his body finally discovered, too late for any hope of survival. His death was a painful reminder of how nature can both awe and consume those who venture too far into its depths. If you want more stories, tell us in the comments.